welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you are watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Hello. Doing all right.
Good. And this week, we are talking to a couple of guys who created this amazing podcast called Allies. And I'll sort of unpack that a little bit later, or I'll have them unpack a little bit later. But we are joined by the creators. So Bryce Klehm, he's the associate editor of Lawfare, and Max Johnston, who's the senior creative producer at Goat Rodeo. So thank you so much for being here, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So Bryce, maybe you can start us off first and just kind of tell us, like, what is the Allies podcast and why did you guys decide to create it?
Sure. So Allies is a 7-episode narrative podcast series that details the involvement of translators and interpreters in the U.S.'s war in Afghanistan. And it really focuses on this thing called the Special Immigrant Visa program, SIV program, that was created in order to protect interpreters and translators who were at risk due to their work for the United States throughout the 20-year war in Afghanistan. So the podcast starts just before 9/11, before the U.S. invasion, and it goes all the way through to the withdrawal this past August. And the way that we sort of came up with the series was after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which everybody watched play out on their TV screens over the course of a few weeks. We were really wondering, how can we even begin to unpack the U.S.'s war in Afghanistan? I mean, it spanned 20 years. I'm 25 years old, spanned most of my conscious life. And when I arrived at the SIV program and interpreters and translators, I thought this might be a good device because interpreters and translators touched every aspect of the U.S.'s mission and what the U.S. was trying to create there. And the SIV program was, in my mind, the U.S. government's chance to sort of at least try and remedy some of the errors that the U.S. had made and try to honor promises to the U.S.'s allies in Afghanistan. So the series covers a lot. I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure we're going to get into a lot more.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I want to, I want to commend both of you for the just the attention to detail that you put into this thing, because I'll be honest, like, this is the first time we've met. I didn't know you were 25. I would have thought that you were a lot older because of the way and the care in which sort of like some of the story was woven. Because I mean, like, our involvement in Afghanistan started before you were born. Wait, no, it wasn't. 2 years after you're born, if I'm doing my math right. It'd be like the equivalent of me, trying to do a documentary on like World War I or II or something like that. Like, I wasn't there. So hats off to you guys. But Max, so you were the creative producer. You work with Goat Rodeo. So before I kind of ask you about, some of the stuff that went into it, like what the heck is a Goat Rodeo?
I think the question I get asked most often in this line of work. Goat Rodeo, as I understand it, my CEO, the guy who hired me, comes from a military family. And the way he tells it is that it's a term used in the military for a mission that everyone knows is going to go poorly. And you got a strange objective. You have no idea how you're going to accomplish it, but everyone's going to charge ahead anyway. And if you've ever worked in podcasting, it's the most apt metaphor, I think, for this line of work. So a lot of people think I work at a rodeo with animals, with livestock, which in some cases is more interesting than my actual job.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, so how did the Goat Rodeo Lawfare relationship start? Especially, like in this context of, sort of documenting these really, really complex stories and telling it, for the audio listener.
Sure. So the relationship, I started working at Lawfare in 2020, and the relationship began sort of before I got there, but Goat Rodeo is Lawfare's sort of primary podcast production team when we do these narrative series from time to time. And that's sort of how the relationship started. They also help produce our daily podcast, the Lawfare podcast, which covers sort of more news of day and things like that. But that's really how it's my understanding that that's how the relationship evolved.
Yeah, and we had done some scripted narrative work, and I think both Goat Rodeo and Lawfare around this time last year were looking to do something interesting, kind of, something a little more involved, and that's kind of how this show came together.
Got it. So that's interesting. Like, I didn't know that you produced their Lawfare. I mean, because like, if I'm just being honest, I'm a bit of a Lawfare fanboy. So I love listening to Lawfare. Love listening to Rational Security 1 and 2. I miss Susan Hennessy. But I think the work you guys do is great. And one of the things I always try to push out to our audience is like, so since the January 6th hearings started happening, I've been recording them because I want to make sure that people have full access to it. And, so I record it. I don't edit it. I think you guys did something similar for like the Mueller trial or something like that. So that's kind of where I got my idea from. So generally when I record them, I always tell people, hey, you should listen to the Lawfare roundup and their analysis of the of the hearing, because I think they pair well, So just hats off to you guys. But my other question I was going to ask you, Max, was, so like, did you have to go to Afghanistan? Like, did you have to like travel, and meet these interpreters?
No, so the whole project was done remotely, almost entirely remotely. We did some in-person interviewing in our studio in Washington, D.C., but we conducted all the interviews remotely, and were able to track down, I think, a pretty incredible list of interviewees that spanned everything from, people that served in Iraq and Afghanistan, to interpreters and translators, to, senior military command, to ambassadors, to elected officials. So we were able to do the whole project remotely, and I think we were able to do that because a lot of people wanted to talk about this issue. They wanted to talk about interpreters and translators and the SIV program. This seemed to be sort of an untapped market in terms of audio, sort of long-form reporting. So in the midst of COVID and pandemic protocols, we were able to get access to a lot of people, at their homes, and we interviewed people in both hemispheres, people in the United States. We talked to at least one source who's still in Afghanistan. And really, I think the show's better off for it.
That's amazing. One thing that's so interesting to me about this project is, coming from the angle of interpreters, I think is brilliant, because you have both the culture that they've grown up in, so they understand it, but then they understand at least they know the language, and they understand they understand some of the issues and some of the culture of the English-speaking world in America, maybe in particular. But when we go into these countries, you kind of get this idea that America goes in, it doesn't need any help, it just goes in like, riding high and just is the savior that comes in and helps everyone. And of course, I'm saying it a little bit tongue in cheek. I love our country, but I know I'm saying a little tongue in cheek. But what did you find out about the reliance that the U.S. military has upon locals? And how did that strike you? What did you come away with that?
Sure, I'll take this one. Before 9/11, I think we have Corey Shockey, who was on President Bush's National Security Council during his first and a little bit of the second term. And she said it best, where she said, I bet there were less than 20 people in the entire U.S. government that really had language and cultural knowledge of Afghanistan. Think about it. Who do you know that speaks Dari or Pashto, and which universities have language departments in that? And even when you compare it to something like Iraq, one journalist told us, at least in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was a large Arab American population that existed, and you can, it's my understanding, could be wrong, but you can sort of get around with modern standard Arabic in Iraq. But in Afghanistan, that just wasn't the case. There's nearly 60 languages in total in Afghanistan when you get down to it, and
that's amazing.
Yeah, and right from the get-go, and this is something we try to capture in episode 1, right from the get-go, the U.S. had to rely on local partners. And the CIA had an existing relationship because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, and so they were pretty much the primary agency that knew the most about the country. And it really, the relationship just took off from there. And then when you think about, the U.S. came in and really pretty quickly toppled the Taliban government and then was just left with a country. And the U.S. had to,
Yes.
whether we really wanted to or not, in my view, they sort of had to. They couldn't just leave in complete chaos. And so from that point on, I mean, talk about trying to build an entire government, army, educational institutions. You're going to need people that speak the language one way or another. And so it just infected every aspect of everything the U.S. was trying to do.
That's amazing. Did they get rich? These translators? What was their rate of pay?
I'm not exactly sure what their rate of pay was, but they were hired in a lot of cases through military contractors, and those companies, I'm pretty sure, made a good amount of money by doing that. Sure they did. And that sort of comes back later in the series. A lot of these military contractors were terrible record keepers. And so when you had to do something like prove your employment, some of these companies went belly up after they hired people because they just nabbed the contract and then, were completely mismanaged. And so when you talk about, how Afghanistan was just flooded with money, both, really during the surge years around 2009, I mean, that really had a massive effect on it. And I'm not sure if a lot of these interpreters came away particularly, materially much, much richer. My guess would be that a lot of contractors who were doing a lot of building around U.S. military bases and infrastructure in Afghanistan, my guess would be that they would probably make off a little bit better.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you touched on it earlier. You talked about the SIV program. So maybe kind of give us, the 30,000 foot view of what that program is, who it was designed for, and maybe like why did it get so jacked up?
Sure. So the SIV program itself, before these wars, was used in the State Department, primarily in embassies abroad, as a way to reward local employees who had worked for the U.S. for, in some cases, multiple decades. So let's say you had somebody that worked for the U.S. for 20 years, and as a reward for their service, they would get this process where they were able to come to the United States and become a citizen as a result of that. So that's what it was before. And then during the war in Iraq, really, when that was started really going south around 2005, 2006, Senator Ted Kennedy, we detailed this in episode 2, and others recognized that, okay, a lot of the U.S.'s local partners are coming under threat as a result of working for us. We've got to do something to protect them, or else, guess what? Nobody's going to want to help us, and then we'll be completely out of luck in Iraq. And he looked around, and with the help of folks like Ambassador Ryan Crocker, found this already existing Special Immigrant Visa program and tried to sort of on the fly. And Senator Ted Kennedy's former National Security Advisor, Sharon Waxman, says this. It's basically, it wasn't a perfect solution to the problem, but it was a solution. And they were trying to do it in the middle of a war, as they would say. And, not everything always goes according to plan, but that's basically how the program came to be the primary way to get the U.S.'s partners, be they translators, interpreters, or in other cases, contractors, out of these countries. And it became really messed up pretty much from the get-go because of a number of things. The bureaucracy, I mean, especially the U.S. immigration bureaucracy after 9/11 was so, I don't even know how to put it, just complicated and so strenuous. And a lot of the security checks that had to take place were super burdensome on both applicants and people advocating for the applicants. And there's one person that we talked to in the series, Colonel Steve Miska, was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he was a big SIV advocate, but he was a U.S. Army colonel in Iraq, and he chose to prioritize the SIV for his interpreters and translators. And that's not something somebody above him told him to do. He just recognized it was the right thing, because if these interpreters and translators were going to trust them, they needed some method of saying, here's how we can protect you.
Yeah, that's amazing, because I think about how in a place where you could be seen, right, as an enemy, for, you have an invading force, no matter how you cut it, life was getting messed up in some way, right? So you have, I can see how it could be a very dangerous job, and for us to let people just sit and be, basically sitting ducks. And maybe we did do that. I guess we'll find out as we move on, or if you listen to the podcast. But it's just amazing, that people would even do it. And I want to ask you to, maybe it's going to be a guess, it's never going to be totally objective, but what do you think were the internal motivations of people who applied to become a translator? I mean, what kind of, you kind of outlined maybe some of what the United States did to help them or potentially help them and protect them, but what were the risks that they faced? What would this why would they do it? What would motivate them to ally with the invading force?
Yeah, I'll take this one, and Bryce, feel free to step up if I say anything wrong. But, there were an assortment of reasons. I think the main one was this was a very real opportunity for these folks. Several of the interpreters we talked to viewed this as, look, there's a huge U.S.-American troop presence in Afghanistan. One of the interpreters we sort of provide a biography of in episode 3, a guy named Fred. He had learned English growing up. He grew up in Kabul, but mentioned he had went to college for a couple months. This was a little bit after the U.S. invasion, and was just sort of aimlessly wandering through his life. Didn't know what was in store for him. And he heard rumors that Americans were at Bagram Air Base, which was, a short drive away. Just drove up to the gate, asked them if they were hiring. And so I think on the base sort of this conversation, it was just an economic opportunity, or an opportunity to sort of achieve something that they otherwise haven't had a chance to really access. But then a lot of the interpreters and translators we talked to or covered in the show were really inspired by American pop culture, and thus the sort of ideals that American pop culture represented. We sort of profiled several interpreters who their first interactions with English and American culture were through movies, were through action movies. Several interpreters mentioned Rambo. Another interpreter mentioned an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Yeah, so, at a young age.
What's that? What's the one? Sorry, what's the one Arnold Schwarzenegger movie where he basically is with his daughter? It was Alyssa Milano. It was and she was his daughter. It's crazy. And then he throws this huge steel pipe through someone, and he goes, "Let out some steam." That's the really famous. Do you remember? Do you guys remember?
I think
find it. It's Commando.
I think
maybe
it was Commando.
I think it was Commando.
Nobody remembers Grandpa.
But I remember George Clooney came up in several conversations. Tom Hanks came up in several conversations. So some of it was an economic rationale, but some of it was, they were young, they were impressionable, they saw a movie that really resonated, and then once the Americans came, both to Iraq and Afghanistan, they bought into these American ideals and, the opportunity and freedom that I think that initially, was the original messaging around the invasion, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's a complicated mix of what motivated these interpreters and translators to seek out the work. And of course, what motivated them, got murkier over time because of the reality of the job, right? You go in with, I think, a sort of a bright-eyed idea of what this invasion and this troop presence looked like. And then your life is actually on the line, and you're actually faced with, people seeing Afghans or Iraqis wearing American military garb, and they're on the front lines with these American soldiers, in clear view of the enemy. And I think that original sort of idealistic motivation for this work really turned into something pretty different pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I will say,
So-
sorry if I could just jump in here really
No,
quickly.
go ahead, Bryce. Yep.
And just to give sort of examples of how different some of the process was for them getting hired. In Fred's case, he just walked up to the base and was like, I want to be hired as a translator. What do I have to do? And then he went through the whole hiring process that we talk about a little bit. But in another case, you know, we heard from an interpreter who, right after the U.S. invaded Iraq, just sort of came up to the Americans as they were kind of like walking around, and they were like, hey, does anybody speak English? And he was like, yeah. And then he sort of slowly started working for them more and more until it became a formal thing. So it's really just vastly different. And I think especially with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for Americans, they were so distant in a lot of spaces. You know, you can look at polling data that is pretty depressing about how, you know, uninvolved people were. But for these people, I mean, this radically touched every part of life in those countries. And that's something that, you know, we try to capture.
Yeah, and I think that's such an honorable thing to do, to try to capture that and give that perspective. I guess you had mentioned, Max, that the ideals, right, of freedom and, you know, maybe self-sufficiency or the ability to, you know, be able to choose your career, or, you know, the opportunity for prosperity or whatever. Those were the kind of things that were like a target, or that were really shown as, this is why we're coming in here. This is why we're not an invading force, we're a saving force. So did that change over time? Did those motivations from the American side, do you think, become different? And of course, you can only speak from what you think in your experience, but did you sense that there is a shift in the actual motivations of being in Afghanistan?
I don't know if I could speak to the motivation of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think one thing in the show we learned a lot about was what, you know, if you were an Afghan or an Iraqi that was hired by a U.S. contractor for that reason, right? You bought into these ideals, right? The idea that the Americans were going to be a liberating force. And, you know, you live that reality in your day-to-day life. Very intense bonds formed between Afghan and Iraqi interpreters and the American soldiers that they fought with. But you see the nature of that service and those ideals being confronted with the fact that these Afghan and Iraqi interpreters were put in a uniquely dangerous position during the course of these wars, being that they were on the front lines, they were the liaison, the point of contact between the Americans and the local populations, and they became targets by the insurgents. So in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban saw these interpreters front and center. They interacted with them. And so when it came to ambushes, when it came to kidnapping, extortion, murder, they went after the interpreters. They knew these interpreters were the eyes and ears of the conflict. And without these interpreters, the Americans couldn't accomplish even basic tasks. And so I think you see those ideals they came into this work with being confronted with the reality of it. And that's gets even sort of a harsher reality when they tried to leave the war zone, when they tried to come to the United States. And of course, if they were working in any capacity for a long amount of time, they really wanted to come to the United States. You know, they had heard so much about it from the people they were serving with. And then leaving the dangerous battlefield and then wading into American political and legal bureaucracy, navigating a legal system that isn't in their native language, that, as we all people who speak English would know, just trying to get your passport, it can be strange and convoluted, let alone if you're an Afghan trying to go through security checks and vetting and, you know, provide the documents that are necessary. I think all those ideals were consistently confronted by these interpreters and translators over the course of their time. And, you know, it became an increasingly ugly picture of what they were dealing with, both on the battlefield and then once they tried to, you know, come to the United States.
Yeah, you know, I don't know if you guys have seen this meme, but it's like, it shows a picture of Captain America, and it's like this is what Americans like view themselves as. And then there's a picture of Homelander from The Boys, if you've ever seen that. And like, this is how like the rest of the world views us. Like, and as I was listening to your podcast series, I mean, it was frustrating to no end, because so I'm a veteran. I deployed on the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003. I was an infantry guy, so I was, boots on the ground, doing all that kind of fun stuff. And we used interpreters, and it's one of the reasons why like your series was so impactful, because like we used interpreters, and two of the interpreters we had, we found decapitated because they were helping the Americans. The last interpreter that we had was a Syrian guy. He was a Christian. I mean, like, he rode in our striker vehicle, so him and I got to be pretty close. But like when we left, I remember just thinking, man, I really wish he could like come back with me. I mean, like him and I were pretty good friends, and he had a pretty good funny sense of humor, and he said a lot of the same stuff that you're saying, that he learned a lot of his cuss words from soldiers, from other Joes, but he was super cool. And like, and I often think about him, if he was one of the ones that was offered an SIV, but without the help of an interpreter in a foreign country, I mean, like, we couldn't communicate just to the people to say, hey, have you seen any IEDs? Like, because we just don't have that relationship. And kind of, and to answer like your question earlier, Josh, about, has that attitude changed? One thing I can tell you specifically just from my days in Iraq was, people's perception of Americans' involvement will change depending on what other, like, so in this case, there was like insurgents, ISIL, and all kinds of other Saddam's regime. They would like almost kind of like selling them a timeshare, but like, hey, you want these Americans out of here? If you want these Americans out of here, just carry this package, put it on that corner, and it'll help get them out of this area, so people will just be like, yeah, I'm sick and tired of these 3-hour traffic jams because the soldiers want to set up a traffic control point or something, like, I'm tired of them busting through my business and not giving me any money. So all of them can, be changed. But anyways, I digress to say this, that one of the things I really appreciate about your series was you did a good job spreading the wealth of responsibility across multiple presidential administrations. It's easy to kind of go into something like this and think, oh man, it's going to be super anti-Trump or super anti-Biden or super whatever. But like, I don't think that you guys pulled any punches on where each administration failed. And I'm wondering if maybe you can kind of just talk about the impact, say that, Trump's, extreme vetting had, and then maybe the effect that Biden had in the sudden withdrawal.
Sure. So I'll talk about extreme vetting a little bit, and that's what episode 5 is titled, Extreme Vetting. And if people remember, the Trump administration came in, obviously, on a very anti-immigration platform. And what extreme vetting did was supposed to, I guess, do is increase the amount of security checks for a population, a refugee population in particular, that was already the most vetted possible population coming into the United States. And we talked with Ambassador Mark Starella, who was a career State Department employee and was the head of the Bureau of Refugees, Migration, and Population during the Trump administration. And what he says is when they saw these extreme vetting requirements, they were like, what do you mean extreme vetting? This is already the most intense process. And what really happened for a lot of these bureaucrats, this is something that we tried to capture. And I don't say bureaucrat in like a derogatory sense. I just mean somebody who works within the State Department whose job is to process these applications, is when a new presidential administration came in, like the Trump administration, the incentive structures changed. And one really revealing thing that I think Ambassador Starella says is that in the past, before the Trump administration, when they would encounter a problem with an applicant, they would put it aside and say, okay, we'll circle back to this, and in some cases they would, in some cases they probably wouldn't, but it wasn't a blanket no. But he says when a new administration came in, it was clear to them, you will never get in trouble for just rejecting an applicant, flat out. And that incentive structure, the culture starts at the top, and that really slowed down the process, and the numbers bear that out. I think by the end of the Obama administration, there's something like 4,000 Afghan SIVs being processed a year. And then pretty much after the Trump administration put all these requirements in place, it was about half that number. And then it continued to go down. And this is all during, at the same time, the Trump administration is openly negotiating with the Taliban and saying, we're going to leave. So he's closing the door and basically leaving them locked, if you want to use an analogy, locked in a room with their captors, basically, is what that policy effectively did. Now, when the Biden administration came in, there's a really good Atlantic article that's really informative about this by George Packer, and he really spells it out over a long period of time. But there were a lot of people within the Biden administration who had worked in refugee advocacy and SIV advocacy before and thought that they had more time, and thought that, the entire U.S. withdrawal was predicated on the assumption that, okay, the Afghan government will last another year or two, and we'll be able to do this more slowly. And advocates were saying, what are you talking about? We should start evacuating these people now, as soon as possible, right after they announced the withdrawal in April of 2021. And the Biden administration basically didn't follow through on that, and we all saw what happened last August when the plug was pulled really quickly.
Yeah, it was it was really devastating actually to watch, and I think for all of us that had any, that remember when we went in, that remember, all those, the war, and then obviously like you point out in your podcast, began to be forgotten, but it's just like it came into full view to the American public, and it was just hard to watch, and it was really gut-wrenching to watch, to be honest with you. And so I'm looking at this, what you look at to say, this was a failure, right? Whatever metrics they were using, right, to go out in the way we did, felt like a failure watching it. One thing that I always kind of notice in life and is the difference between intentions and reality, or intentions and consequences. And you had mentioned, Bryce, the incentive structure. I'm sure that whoever made this, I'm sure that whoever made the increased vetting or intensified vetting would probably say we were doing this for the best of everyone involved, or they probably wouldn't say, certainly not publicly, that, well, we don't really care about Afghani people, or we don't really want them to come here, or we don't really, whatever it is. But what you're pointing out is that you have this, once the incentive structure changes, the consequences come. And I guess, what do you from doing all this research in Afghanistan, what do you imagine that the shift was like between the intentions that we had and the consequences that came about? Like, why did it become so chaotic? Why was it like you have some of the best people in the world working on it? Is it because of the nature of government, the nature of military? And I know, again, this is like a deep question. There's not like a right answer necessarily, but I'm curious in hearing your thoughts on that, because having such an intimate view of it, in your research, I'm sure that you came up with some insights as you were walking around that you shared in the podcast and those that you didn't. So what do you think?
Are you talking about sort of the broader U.S. mission in Afghanistan, more broadly speaking, outside of the SIV program, or both?
Yeah, both, really. I mean, it just struck me about the difference between our intentions and the intentions of the bureaucracy and then what actually happened. And I don't know if you have any insights on that, on what actually happened there.
Yeah, so there was one sort of thing that Max and I would talk about a little bit, and that's how we came to see at certain points that the failures with the SIV program mirrored a lot of the failures with the broader war itself. So what do I mean by that? The war, I think the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a guy named Jonathan Sopko, it's a government agency. They release a ton of reports basically over the past, 10 plus years maybe, that basically analyzes, funding to Afghanistan, what's going wrong. They issue lessons learned reports and everything. And this is a public resource that anybody can go and see. And one thing that he talks about and Sigar's reports talk about are the fact that they would undergo the U.S. mission in Afghanistan every year would undergo an annual lobotomy, in that units would rotate out on a yearly basis. So there was very little institutional knowledge, and a unit or an officer would have to get completely acquainted with a brand new situation every single year. And so it's sort of I think a little bit overused, but they say, we fought, we fought a 20-year war, we fought one 20-year war, or you know what I'm trying to say.
We got you.
Yeah. And so
a 20-year war, one year at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And with when you look at the SIV program itself had to be renewed on a year-to-year basis after 2013. Congress had to put it in the NDAA or some bigger bill every year to renew this program. So instead of really trying to improve it on a year-to-year basis, they were just having to recreate it and have the same fights with people who oppose the SIV program every single year. And so to me, a lot of this came down, and I could be right, I could be wrong. I'm not a military strategist by any stretch of the imagination, not a lawyer, all those disclaimers, is a lot of this was just about how the U.S. government operates on a yearly cycle, and how there's really some limited institutional knowledge in something like the U.S.'s mission in Afghanistan. Now, there are people that dedicated their whole life within the U.S. government to that, and they should not be discounted at all. But in just the broader prosecution of the war, a lot of it was just a lot of the same mistakes over and over again. And SIV program had some of those, the same sort of yearly, same mistakes, same story over and over again.
That's a profound insight about the institutional knowledge. Max, do you have any thoughts on it?
I think just in addition to what Bryce just said, the war in Afghanistan and the conflict as a whole really evaded, I think, like the traditional ways which we understand war. Everything from the nature of Afghanistan. It's a very complicated place, 60 languages, some of which aren't even written languages. They're just oral. So like the battlefield landscape is a very unique one. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda as an enemy is very immersed within Afghan society, to the point that they have very deep roots and deep connections with Afghan society. And then everything about the way the war unfolded, the fact that it wasn't, for most of the war, the timeline of the war, it wasn't driven by American-led combat. We were a force that was training a native indigenous force, being the Afghan security forces, the military, to fight the conflict themselves. So that's not to say that Americans weren't at risk, and thousands of Americans lost their lives and thousands more were injured. But it doesn't fit, maybe what the American public's traditional idea of a war is. And so that affected everything from the politics to the bureaucracy to the way, the way Bryce mentioned, the way troops were thrown in and out of the battlefield, to the way the command handled the war. It was just a unique conflict in a unique place, and 5 different presidential administrations tried every tactic sort of under the sun to try to achieve different objectives. Even the objectives and the way we measured success and progress in the country changed on an annual basis, or between presidential administrations. So just nothing about this war is simple or clean or tidy or black and white. And I think you really saw that unfold over 20 years. And I think it's one of the reasons why the American public, has sort of waxed and waned in terms of how immersed in the conflict they were and how often people sort of pay attention to it. I mean, even going forward now, I think Afghanistan is on a lot of people's sort of back burner in terms of the topics that they're really immersed in. So this conflict was just strange. But, it's what made it such a tremendous thing to cover, is that it is so dense, it is so complicated, and there are tons of people that are doing incredible work studying this conflict, but to really look at it in its full scope over the course of decades is a really interesting way to see how the U.S. government operates both at home and abroad.
That's really cool. And I'm curious on sort of the political angle. I mean, I know that most military actions are all motivated by politics. Like, I've been in the military. We've had a Green Beret on this show that basically stated as much. It's like, yeah, every time I jump into a place, like there's politics that's sort of, causing, me to jump out of an airplane or something. And on your podcast, you spoke to a couple members of Congress. So I'd like for you to kind of talk about that, but also, kind of in the same vein, the House just passed the 2023 NDAA, so the National Defense Authorization Act. I think it's Act. So we're just waiting to see what the Senate has to say. But I mean, the Senate was already talking about like $857 billion. And I'm curious, if some of the Congress people that you spoke to, one of them, which I don't think, is alive still, but if those same Congress members have done anything within the NDAA to kind of help the SIV application. I mean, number one, $857 billion is a huge number. I mean, it's almost $1 trillion. So, surely there has to be a few, nickels and dimes in there for the SIV program. So I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts both on, the Congress members you spoke to in the show, and then the NDAA for 2023. How about you start us off on that, Max, and then maybe Bryce can talk about the NDAA stuff.
Yeah. So specifically in the show, we spoke to several different sitting members of Congress. The two that come to mind are Seth Moulton and Pete Meyer, who took a much publicized and, in hindsight, rather infamous trip to Kabul during the withdrawal. And we spoke to them, just a couple months ago, I'd say in the spring. So well after, I think, the public sort of spotlight had shifted away from Afghanistan to, for lack of a better word, much sexier topics that I think a lot of people are sort of immersed on now. And they, even in that moment, spoke to the lack of momentum and energy being devoted legislatively to SIV and Afghan refugee issues. That's not to say there isn't really, really important work being done. A lot of it is done via nonprofits, via the various sort of evacuation coalitions that have sprung out since the withdrawal, but specifically spoke to really slow movement in Congress. And I think the most specific example that we cover in the last episode of the show is the very uncertain and murky status of a bill called the Afghan Adjustment Act, which was meant to do a bunch of things, but essentially make the pathway for a lot of the refugees who came over, specifically sort of during the withdrawal, a more clear and direct pathway to American citizenship. And a bill that had, on paper, bipartisan support, a bill that was sort of came to be in light of the withdrawal and when a lot of people were really invested in this topic. But you saw, I think, in very typical sort of Washington, D.C. fashion, over the course of months, just the will to pass this thing and the political and legislative will to sort of stick your neck out for these Afghan refugees really just eroded and got lost in the sort of slow churn of any other, very important but very different issues that we're now sort of talking about, to the point where some of our last conversations on the show were with advocates who were saying, look, I don't think this bill is going to get passed. It's a real shame because these same legislators that are opposed to this legislation were asking for help getting their Afghan friends out of Afghanistan during the withdrawal. But there's just not a will and a real sense of urgency on this issue, which is a real shame because it's life or death stakes for thousands of people, both here in the U.S. and even more back in Afghanistan. So I can't speak to the latest in sort of breaking issues. I think Bryce can speak to that a little bit more cogently. But, you know, I think from the second those last flights came out of Afghanistan, it was a slow sort of a slow trickle of information and people really trying to work on this issue. And now we're left in the point where I don't think there's a ton of legislative and political will being spent on this issue. Luckily, there's tons of nonprofits, there's tons of advocates, there's tons of groups that are still working really hard on this. But without, you know, real concrete support in Washington, D.C., the path ahead legally is still really murky.
What do you think, Bryce, about the NDAA?
So in what I've seen from the House Armed Services Committee report on the 2023 NDAA, there are a couple proposals in there that would help. I'm just going to highlight one or two of them. One would be requiring a database, and this is proposed, obviously, completely subject to change between now and whenever it gets passed. But one would be requiring a database of all foreign nationals who work for the United States in a theater of combat operations. And that, I mean, it might sound strange that that doesn't exist now, but one of the really, really big sticky points in the entire SIV program was the fact that the record keeping was so poor, and that the State Department and the Department of Defense didn't really have any integrated data systems of who their foreign nationals were that they had hired. And a lot of that was because they had hired them through contractors. And so that sort of database would really help. I will also say that another reason that the State Department, and this was in the Inspector General of the State Department's report on the SIV program, another reason that the State Department didn't have a really fully modernized and equipped database for this stuff was because the program was allocated on a yearly basis. So they would say that because this we're not sure if this program is going to stick around for long enough. You know, why should we modernize this database system and things like that? So that's one thing that would be a pretty welcome change. Just a couple days ago, the Biden administration took away the I-360 requirement, which was one form that applicants had to fill out, SIV applicants. So this is something aside from the NDA that's actually already happened. And that's a welcome change. But in some of the advocates that I follow have really said, well, this was about 30 days of like a 750-day process. So it's definitely a welcome change, but it's still just, you know, sort of peanuts compared to the entire thing. And then one other thing is I've seen it proposed, I'm not sure if it's going to be in the 2023 NDAA, is that they would basically make the SIV program permanent, a permanent feature of the State Department, not just for Afghans or Iraqis, I think for foreign nationals hired by U.S. in combat operations. And that would help because of some of those problems that I mentioned earlier about the yearly allocation process. I'm sure they would probably have to still allocate visa spots on a yearly basis, but the resources would be there within the State Department and things like that. So those are a couple highlights. I mean, it really is all going to be subject to change. The Afghan Adjustment Act that Max mentioned was supposed to be attached to a Ukraine supplemental bill back in the spring, and a lot of advocates were really hoping that would, you know, clear up a ton of hurdles and clear pathways to citizenship for people who aren't directly eligible for the SIV program but were evacuated in August. And then at the last minute, that was taken out due to security concerns, which is so familiar to anybody who knows the story of the SIV program. So I can't say, you know, a lot of the advocates and activists that we talk to are not particularly hopeful that a lot will be done. But
yeah, you know, I'm curious. So just a couple more questions left for you, and I'm assuming that putting this podcast series together, you probably had a ton of footage, ton of recordings, ton of data. You're trying to, you know, figure out what's the best, you know, way to sort of organize them all to kind of create like a cogent story. So I'm curious, maybe from if both you guys can kind of give me a response, like, are there stories or are there interactions that you captured that didn't quite make it to production, but you thought, you know, is still really important to tell?
I mean, we definitely left some stuff on the cutting room floor and a couple interviews that were really strong. We interviewed a writer and advocate named Kirk Johnston, who was a USAID employee, if I remember correctly, who worked in Iraq in the mid-2000s, I believe. I think 2005, maybe, when he went over. And Kirk was one of the main architects of the SIV program for interpreters and translators. He was just a guy who was working for USAID and really wanted to help the local partners that we had hired and were working with in Iraq specifically. He studied Arabic in college and really came to sort of relate to a lot of the Iraqis that he was working with, and saw firsthand how these people were uniquely in danger, at risk because of this work. And so one thing he started doing that you see sort of echoed in the work on this issue, dating, you know, now going almost 20 years ahead, was he just started collecting lists. He just started writing down names of people who needed to get out of Iraq, people who were in danger, and just giving these lists to journalists, people he knew in the State Department, people he knew in the White House, just any mechanism to say, hey, this person's in danger. What can you do for them? And he ended up working closely with legislators in the initial sort of expansion of the SIV program. But he really, and he's been interviewed on NPR and has told his story in many different fashions. But he was really one of the principal architects of this entire issue that we were talking about, and has a remarkable story and a remarkable perspective, and a very blunt, just honest person. You know, no frills. He'll tell you exactly what he thinks. And we interviewed Kirk, and we got some really great tape from him, and we used a little bit in our last episode because he really succinctly described the themes that we were trying to talk about, this idea of letting down our allies and the importance of honoring our promises. But in our second episode, which is specifically about the war in Iraq, he didn't quite fit in the context of the story we were crafting there. That episode, I think, maybe had some of the most voices of our entire season. And so he just didn't quite fit in, and we had some late additions to that episode, and I know Bryce and I were both pretty bummed about not including him in that episode. Luckily, we were able to include him in the last episode. And if Kirk listens to this, I hope he knows how grateful we were for his time. But I think there were a couple interviews like that. I do think the show represents the sort of most crystallized, kind of like efficient way of telling this story. Going in, we knew we wanted to tell it in a kind of specific, precise way within this very big and broad context, and also rooted around very sort of personal, firsthand accounts. And so with that, you lose a lot of the sort of stuff on the edges. But I'd say losing Kirk was tough. And anyone who's interested in this issue, I highly recommend. He's got books, he's tons of articles, tons of interviews, like Kirk Johnston. Check him out. But I'd say that was one I was bummed about losing. But Bryce, I feel like we did a good job at, I don't know, I put everything I know about this issue in the show. There's literally, you guys know as much about this as I do now that it's done. So, but I don't know, Bryce, was there anything else that we left out?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, like Max said, the scope of this was so narrow. Like, we tried to really bound it up. And so there were some interviews that were really fascinating with one journalist in particular. His name's Wesley Morgan. He's got a book called The Hardest Place, which just focuses on the Pesh Valley in Afghanistan and the whole war there. And I'd highly, highly recommend that book. It is fantastic. And it is also a very specific story, but is so much more broadly representative of how the U.S. decided to prosecute the war in Afghanistan. And it talks about all the pitfalls and how, in that one valley, in that one region, it was so dependent on the U.S. commander there and what they wanted to do and how they wanted to prosecute the war. So I wish we could have included a little bit more of that. But like I said, we were pretty narrow in scope there. And so I would highly recommend Wesley Morgan's book, The Hardest Place. He's got a ton of interviews out there.
That's really cool. So are there any other pending projects Lawfare and Goat Rodeo are looking at? Anything that you can break on our podcast?
Well, we have some series already out there. One of them's on January 6th. That's currently going on. It's
really
called
good.
Aftermath. I'd highly recommend that as well. But Max, you want to?
I'm trying to think what I can publicly disclose.
Everything.
Goat Rodeo's working on a bunch of different projects. Some of them are in a similar space as Allies. Big sort of federal government political stuff. But besides that, I'm sorry. I wish I could be more transparent, but I can't. Right. I would love to. I will say, Allies was a tremendous experience, and it's a story that's still ongoing. And so we've talked a little bit about doing a bonus episode, especially as we get closer to the 1 year sort of marker for a lot of people, which is last August when they saw this withdrawal. And look, Afghanistan is getting worse by the day in terms of life under Taliban rule. We covered a little bit of that in the show and the current landscape, but I would implore everyone who listens to this show to, stay invested with Afghanistan. Just because the American troops are gone does not mean that is still sort of a growing humanitarian crisis. And so who knows what the future holds? Bryce is a very busy man. But so, we've talked about, doing special episodes or stuff for the show. And I know that this story resonated so much with me that, I would love to revisit it. So that's as much as I can give right now. I wish I could say more.
Right. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you both kind of giving us your time and talking about this production. Like I mentioned at the top, it's just, for a person like me who has had connection with their interpreters, I think it's a story that needs to be told. I think it needs to be told more because, I don't want to be Homelander. I want to be Captain America. So to whatever degree I can help us become Captain America, I'm going to do it. So thank you both to Goat Rodeo and to Lawfare. Just keep on doing what you guys are doing. You're doing great stuff out there. So thanks.
Thanks. And if I can just add one thing, which is to anybody listening that listens and wants to get involved in some sort of refugee in any capacity, whether it's dropping stuff off at a food bank or going through a church group or religious group to get involved. There's a ton of different ways to do that. And one of the highlights, this is an overall depressing story, but one of the highlights that we try to illustrate are a lot of people that stepped up, a lot of Americans who we're not refugee experts, we're not lawyers, we're not any of that, but tried to help. And so I would encourage people, there's a ton of different ways to do that if they listen to the show and decide, that it's something that they can't unsee and want to do something about. Yeah. Sorry to add.
That's really great. Yeah. So
that's awesome.
Thanks again, guys. And thank you to our listeners. And we will see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you. Care.